because being a conscript society means something. And the level of militarization within Israeli society is something that I think is not just a symptom of occupation, but it's also one of the causes to it. There's a circular effect there. And really, this society, in its roots, is extremely militarized. And that means that the way that we think about solutions, the way to any kind of problem, the way that we think about what action is needed at a given moment is usually militarized, and that's a very good way to maintain the status quo, or even have it get worse. So that's just kind of why I think this is important to talk about. And when I talk about militarization, what do you all think about? If I just say the word militarization, even in your own context, what are the things that pop to mind? Power. Soldiers, control,
Weapons.
Military-industrial complex.
right?
Intimidation.
A certain mindset.
So all of these things, I mean, militarization has so many different ways that it can present in our lives. And today, a lot of the conversation in the U.S. is also about, obviously, militarization of police, militarization of borders, right? So kind of we have this traditional idea that militarization has to do with militaries. It has to do with soldiers. And what we see today more and more is that there's a blurring of lines of what is military and what is police, both ways, by the way. So we talk a lot about militarization of police. What we hardly talk about is politicization of military, in the sense that if you think about the Israeli military or soldiers that you saw in checkpoints, they're not doing the jobs of soldiers, right? If you think traditionally soldiers in tanks and whatever, that's not what they're doing either, right? It's something between police and military, and it's actually could have been all the same people. There's a whole blurring of lines today, which is also a blurring of lines if we think, again, traditionally soldiers or military is the thing that's out there on the front lines, wherever those front lines might be. In the case of the U.S., that's obviously also overseas. In other countries, not necessarily. And police is this domestic thing. And again, if you think about it now, these lines are being blurred, right? The whole concept of homeland security is a concept that at core is about blurring those lines. If we think about the kind of wars that are conducted today, nobody conducts a war against a country anymore. Wars are conducted against concepts, right? The war on terror. War on terror means that you don't have some enemy overseas or somewhere specific that you can say, okay, that's where we send the military. The war on terror is everywhere. It's between us all the time, right? And that's where Homeland Security comes. It's not just that. The war on crime, the war on drugs, all these conceptual wars that mean that the enemy is everywhere, and therefore anyone can become an enemy. And someone said before control when we talk about militarization. That means that everyone needs to be under control, right? And obviously some people more than others, and we'll get into all the ethnic and racial aspects of that again, I'm still speaking very conceptually, so I'm sure you can all relate to that in your own context as well. It also means that it is a constant war. You don't end a war on drugs, right? Assuming none of us imagine a world with no drugs, you don't end a war on drugs, which means it's constant. Someone before said the military-industrial complex. I think one of the things that were really kind of clarified by Eisenhower and speaking about that is this shift from a world where we used to have what was called a war economy, right? So there would be a war, and then the economy would adjust to a war, and the war would end, and the economy would adjust back to civil life, which it doesn't anymore, which is part of having perpetual wars, that the economy doesn't. The issue of military-industrial complexes is now a constant. And so we'll try to touch upon all of these things in the Israeli context. Obviously, we're not going to touch upon all of them, but I do want us to kind of have this more global conceptual idea in mind when we talk about what does it look like here. And I'll start really from the most basic things, from the public sphere itself. Have you had a chance to walk around West Jerusalem or any Israeli city? Not really. One of the things that you would definitely notice is the amount of weapons on the streets. And I'm sure you've seen that as well, being in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, but that would be soldiers on duty and occupying power, so it has a specific kind of connotation to people. But if you walk to West Jerusalem or any Israeli city, you will again see a lot of people out in the street with guns. Part of that are soldiers or police officers on duty. Part of that are soldiers off duty. So combat soldiers take their assault rifles home on a weekend. So now we're in a holiday, which means that if you go up west, you will see quite a lot of civilians or people who are wearing civilian clothes around the weekend or on the holiday from the military, and they will walk around with their M4 assault rifles, because why not? It's what you're supposed to do. We're talking about security guards that hold quite a lot of private arms again. Today we're talking about security companies having licenses for 300,000 guns. It's a population of 8 million people. You can do the math, but that is a hell of a lot of guns.
I think we can beat that in the state.
Possibly. We do also have a very strange concept in which civilians who carry arms need permits. I know that sounds weird. But we do have that. But for instance, our current Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the Internal Security, that's what it's called, it decided to ease the process of getting guns, of permits for civilians. And so you used to have a reason, right? You have to come and say, my reason for getting a gun is I need to work in security, whatever. Today, you don't need a reason. If you were in certain units in the military, if you got a certain training, it's called Sheva, it's like a certain kind of level of boot camp. If you got that training, you can just go and get a gun. And this was just announced a few weeks ago. The first day that this was open, 150 people requested. I think within 3 days it was 400 and something people who requested these permits. And a journalist just did a piece where he tried to go get it. And you have this interview that's supposed to decide if you're fit for it or not. And so as a journalist, he kind of had this backstory that mainly what he wanted the woman in front of him to understand is that he had a really bad divorce, is really angry at his wife, and wants his gun for that, right? Like, he's coming as a journalist, he's trying to expose. They didn't even ask him enough questions for him to be able to say any of that before handing him a permit to a gun. So we do have permits, but it's apparently a very easy system, and it's getting easier and easier. So the amount of weapons, and those are legal weapons, right? We're not even talking about illegal weapons in society as well. What this means, there's a lot of different consequences to this, from domestic murders that are happening quite a lot actually with weapons of security guards. But more than that, there's a normalization effect, right? If you are used to seeing guns everywhere all the time, they become normal. You don't see them anymore. And this is something that I would actually argue that at least for you guys coming from Washington, California, and Indiana, that wouldn't be the case as much, right? You're not used to seeing guns in front of you all the time. You still notice when you see a gun. We don't. Guns are the most normal thing in the world. They're transparent, right? If you are a person that is socialized, that those guns are about your security. Those guns are not a threat to you. And I think that's an important point, right? For Palestinians who see the exact same guns on the streets, they see them because they are a threat to them. And it's not just a question of if that gun can or cannot shoot at different people. It can, obviously. And again, there are cases where Jews will also be shot by these guns. But socially speaking, the way you're educated to address guns is that if you are a Jewish Israeli, these guns are for your security. They're about protection. They're not a threat. And if you're a Palestinian, yes, they are a threat. They're supposed to be a threat. And again, I think we can take this to other places as well. I mean, if you think about the U.S. context, I'm going to allow myself to make a few assumptions here, but as white people in the U.S., the chances that you see an armed police officer and you are scared of him, I'm not saying criticizing and thinking that, it's wrong and has problems and so on, but that you are actually scared, you're not. Because we're all socialized to understand that that weapon is not supposed to be used against you. If you happen to be black, that's not the case, right? So I think we can tell a lot about what happens in the society and the power structures around how militarization plays out and how weapons are seen.
Are Palestinians ever allowed to get guns?
In some cases, yes, you do have some private security. We're talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel. I'll just put that. Yeah. In some cases, yes, especially private security guards. That's more or less the only place where you'll see that. They're very rare. But there are a lot of guns held by Palestinian citizens of Israel, mostly legal weapons. Now, this is also a really interesting case. There's actually a survey that was done recently that showed that the two populations in which gun control is not enforced, so that they have the highest illegal weapons, but also the police does nothing about it, are settlers and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Which is weird, right? Like settlers, we say, okay, we kind of get that. We get how this system works. Why Palestinian citizens of Israel? Thoughts?
They feel threatened.
I can understand why they have weapons, but why does the police not enforce that? I mean, the police in this security paradigm that obviously Palestinians are the enemy, why?
Because they can use it as propaganda.
Possibly. Most Israelis don't know this, though. These guns are not used against Jews, they're used against other Palestinians. And it's the same, I mean, again, we hear that in the States, right? You think about kind of...
Palestinian crime on Palestinian.
Exactly.
We would say black on black.
Well, you would say black on black is Palestinian on Palestinian. Who cares? You don't need to police that because nobody cares. And this is like this concept again in the U.S. We see over policing and under policing at the same time in different angles of that. You'll see the same thing here. And so yeah, that's a good question. So if we go back to kind of the building of Jewish identity culture, so we have this normalization of weapons, and it's not just public sphere. It's not just assault rifles. I lived in a city up north that had 3 tanks in the entrance to it, like pink, green, and yellow. Kids climb on them and play with them, and it's fun. Like that's part of normalizing military.
Yes.
If we go into the education system, one of my favorite examples is a worksheet that teaches kids how to count. So on the one side you have numbers from 1 to 10, and the other side you have symbols. You have like 3 dogs, and you connect it to the number 3. Only instead of dogs, we have tanks and airplanes, and the symbol of the IDF, of the Israeli military. In the same piece of paper, you have olive branches and doves and Knesset, our parliament, and the flag of Israel, and the symbol of the state, the Star of David. Any thoughts about like the person who put that all together? What were they thinking? What's the common denominator?
Normalization.
Normalization, for sure.
That peace is actually won and perpetuated by military.
Right? There's this connection between peace and military. Again, not an Israeli invention, right? We have the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which is if we occupy the world, there's peace. I think that for me, one of the interesting things about this is that when I show this piece of paper to Israelis, everyone knows what the common denominator is. There's no question. It's Israel. Like that's how you visualize Israel. It's institutions, it's symbols, flag, peace, obviously, and the military. It's just how you visualize a state, right? And so that's really part of the identity of the state, and it really goes. I mean, even historically thinking, if I were to ask you, kind of give me the go-to answer to the question, why does the state of Israel exist or have the right to exist? Talking points. Simplest answer.
But God gave it to them.
Right, so we have the religious argument, right? What is the secular argument?
Collective guilt.
What?
Collective guilt.
They suffer.
Okay, collective guilt, that's the European, yeah.
Holocaust,
Definitely, but collective
security.
guilt about what?
Holocaust.
The Holocaust, right? Security. The premise is that Jews need a state to prevent that from happening again, right? And that's why that's where the Holocaust plays in. What is the connection between a state and prevention of a Holocaust? military. Like we don't say that, but actually what creating a state in this context is finding a militarized solution to anti-Semitism. That's what this state is about. It's about being strong enough to defend ourselves. That was the language, right? It's not like that diasporic Jew, and you'll hear a lot of this, a lot of writing about how it's perceived as a weak, feminine, non-fighting diasporic Jew, as opposed to the new Jew that is strong, masculine, works the land, and fights, right? That's the core of what Zionism is about. And so the fact that militarism is part of our identity is not a surprise. That's literally what this country was built on. The first law that was legislated here, the first order that Ben-Gurion gave with the creation of the state was the creation of the military. That's the first thing that you do. And so if we continue, and there's so many examples in textbooks and teaching kids in math books. In a second grade book, I was reading this thing that they had in a pack of chocolate there's 40 pieces of chocolate. In 4 lines, how many rows are there? And the next question is, in a unit there's 27 soldiers. In 3 lines, how many rows are there? Like that's the level that it's at, right?
Wow.
It's literally everywhere. And I can bring a million examples. We won't have time for all of them, but if you go to high school, that's really where it's at its peak. Because these are kids that, they finish high school, they need to join the military. And so you'll have soldiers coming in and out of classrooms to explain about the different units. In the 11th grade, we have kind of something a little bit like basic training, but just for a week. So you play soldier, right? You go out with your classmates to a military base and play soldier for a week. Drill, stance, sit, roll, all those things. You learn how to shoot. That's part of school activity. It's actually not mandatory by law or the Ministry of Education. Schools opt into it because it's fun. What 16-year-old doesn't want to roll in dirt and whatever? It has this whole, it's all fun and games.
There's probably a bit of ostracization too when you don't go with the group.
For sure. On a personal basis. But why would a school do that?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any teachers / people who are parents of kids in the 11th grade, kind of coming up to finals and things like that. Who has a week to spare?
Sure.
From a school perspective, it's just I wouldn't give up a week, but this is something you do. Again, it's part of the default of something that you just do. And again, the kids love it. There's actually this thing that every time there are cuts to the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Defense kind of wants to say, if there are cuts, we will have to cut things. The first thing that they announce that they will cut is this program. Because, from a military perspective, why do you need it? But what happens is that there is mass protests of 16, 17-year-olds who organize their own things in schools, and it's a whole thing, and it's a whole discourse, and very, very soon after that, those cuts will be canceled, right? It's a way, because everyone relates to that.
And the kids want it.
And the kids want it. Again, because it's fun, and it's normal, and it's military, and it's part of a growing up process, and that's how we get all of this.
Compared to studying for math or something.
It's way more fun than math. For sure, learning how to shoot, more fun than math.
Is there a tourist industry for this? Because I know Jerry Seinfeld and his family came over here and did a wonderful week's training with a few days to go out and do some shooting, pretend like you're shooting Palestinians,
So
right?
there's 2 forms of that. One of them is through the birthright trips or the Israel experience trips, which is another kind of birthright. That's very specific for Jews. It is in cooperation with the Israeli military, and there are programs that include at least visits, sometimes trainings and stuff like that. But much more than that, and what Seinfeld did and people of the sort, is that there's a private industry to that now, right? Because Israel is this cool place that is all about how awesome its military is, right? And so people want to experience that. And so now there's a huge private industry that gives people that experience of ex-Israeli soldiers who can say, I come with this and this background, and there are people who are happy to hear that. I don't know how many of you have seen the new, what is it called? What is America? Is that
I was hoping.
Don't get him started.
Janie was going to kick me if I asked this.
So if you
Oh,
haven't
great.
seen it yet,
Yeah.
please go ahead and do. What is America?
Is it a movie?
It is a series. It's a satire show. It's Sacha Baron Cohen. He's
Remember the movie
Jewish
Borat?
comedian.
Borat.
exactly the Borat guy. Anyway, the premise for this series is that he acts as an ex-Israeli soldier who comes to the U.S. to kind of teach new kind of anti-terror stuff. There's a whole range of episodes with different things, but it's amazing to see how much the fact that he introduces himself as an ex-Israeli soldier makes the people in front of him do everything he says, no matter how ridiculous it is. Yeah, including
Cheney.
quite a few of your politicians. But it's because there is this image that Israel is, Israeli soldiers know what they're doing, and it's not just an Israeli image, right? We export that internationally. That is the feeling. So I do want to just track back a bit because we'll get to talk about this as well. But back to the education system and kind of how that's constructed. There's this default of the military. But if you ask soldiers, the soldiers that you meet in checkpoints, why they're there, what do you think their answers will be?
Well, to
To
security,
protect Israel,
security,
right? Security, to protect Israel. So, some of the answers will be, I have to. It's kind of, but a lot of it, if you ask more, if you push more, that will be the answer. It's about protection and security. So I think that together with kind of thinking, how do we see militarization normalized, I think it's also important to ask what is the narrative that is constructed.
At some point, when you get to what the perception of Palestinians is in textbooks.
So I know that some of you got David spoke about that. I won't. I can answer that as a question. Very generally speaking, there is none. Right? There is, and again, there's a book written about it that, of a professor who knows much more than I do about this. But generally speaking, most of the Israeli education system doesn't include Palestinians. The word Palestinian specifically is not a thing. Arabs sometimes. The context where it is brought up is in war with, right? So you teach about the 48 war, you can't ignore Arabs like that. It's not an option. So you teach them as in those cases where you're in war with. And so, but again, there's a lot to be said about the nuances of that, how they're presented. There's a lot of presentation as very primitive and things of the sort. Even talking about like the Zionist endeavors around agriculture and irrigation systems and things like that in the early 20th century comes as opposed to the local primitive, not. So that's a lot of the presentation. But when we go back to kind of constructing, this actually relates pretty well, constructing the narrative. The main narrative of Israeli education, and I take the history curricula as the example of it, because I think that's usually where you really see a narrative the best, is not about Palestinians. Palestinians are almost irrelevant to them. They're a background. They're part of the scenery. The main narrative that you are taught is about fear, right? The final exam in high school that is unified, it's a national exam, has three parts. It has the Second Temple period. It has the Holocaust, and people usually say Second World War. It doesn't have the Second World War. Nobody remembers when Germany invaded France. But we can all tell you what happened in Auschwitz, right? It's about the Holocaust. And then the creation of the state. Those are the three mandatory parts of history. And then you have some other things that you can add to that. But the basic mandatory is those three things. And they tell a story. Right? The Second Temple period is, first of all, the last time there was a Jewish state before this one. Right? And it's exile. It's the destruction of that temple and exile. That's what starts the story that ends 2,000 years later with the creation of the state, with the middle being all about persecution of Jews. Right? That's the Holocaust and so on. We don't learn about a pretty prosperous Jewish community in the Islamic Empire throughout the Middle Ages. We don't like that. That's not interesting. What's interesting was that there was exile, there was anti-Semitism when we were in the diaspora, and then there was a state created. And that's not the end of it, right? There's still this constant anti-Semitism, this constant threat. It is always happening. And I mean, I said that we're actually celebrating one of the decent holidays and the not very interesting ones with Rosh Hashanah. Some of our other holidays are fascinating on this. That there's a month between April and May that for me is usually the best example of that, which starts with Passover. You all know the story of Passover? More or less, right? Exodus from Egypt. I don't know if you know this, but first of all, it's an extremely important holiday in Jewish tradition. I would argue not just a Jewish tradition, the Last Supper, right?
Yeah.
It's a very important holiday. And the story of the Exodus is a story of liberation from persecution, right? It's also a nation-building story. It's the first time that under slavery in Egypt is the first time that the term Israelites is used for Hebrews. It's the first time that we're not just talking about individuals. Right? Until then, there's Joseph and Jacob and all these humans. But the first time we talk about a group is under slavery in Egypt, and then the liberation from them, right? That's how we're created as a nation, out of persecution and the liberation of it, right? And we know that story. A week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. Exactly a week after that is the Soldiers and Victims of Terror Memorial Day. And the following morning is Independence Day. And it's the same story from before, right? There's this historical religious persecution of Jews that is biblical and goes back thousands of years. There's the Holocaust. There's a state at the end of it. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. But soldiers and victims of terror are still dying. Like, it is ongoing. It's not that we can rest now, right? And if that's the idea that you grow up with, it means a few things. First of all, it means Palestinians are irrelevant in the sense that it just happens to be them right now, right? There was this plaque in a school that a friend of mine took a picture of a few years ago in that memorial season, that had in the middle it said, "Who tried to kill us?" And then it had different lines to different groups, so it had like the Romans and the Greeks and Pharaoh, and then same thing, right? It has Hitler, and it has Ahmadinejad, and it has the Arabs, and it's like a complete mix of historical, present day, individuals, peoples, everything you can think of. It's all lumped up, right? And it's not about any of those people. It's about the fact that people try to kill us.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. It happens to be Palestinians right now. And in that paradigm, thinking about things like solutions, right? Creating a situation where nobody's trying to kill us is not in anyone's mindset. All we can think of is how do we make sure they can't, right? That's where a militarized solution comes in. It's when you don't believe that there are any other solution. There's nothing else on the table. And I think that if we think from a generational perspective, we are literally this week, 25 years since Oslo, right? That means that people my age and younger, we don't remember, so there's a lot of problems with Oslo, but Oslo was a time that at least people believed that there was going to be peace, there was going to be a solution. It doesn't matter that we can analyze a lot of the politics around it. The belief around was that was going to happen. People my age or younger don't remember that. We don't remember a time where anyone actually believed there was going to be any form of solution. There is no solution on the table, right? And if you live in this narrative that everyone's always trying to kill you, there's no solution to this. Specifically on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there's nothing on the table. Yes, militarization is the answer. Protecting yourself is the answer. It's literally the only one you have, right? And that's kind of the narrative that is entrenched within us. And I say it's a narrative because I think it's really important to talk about how much that is constructed, right? That the actual lived history of this state, which is very short, has been completely the opposite. I mean, nobody thinks about this, but in the history of this country, there have been two countries that you can actually say that were existential threats to Israel, at war with Israel. Who knows what those countries are?
Iran.
Iran has never been at war with Israel. What?
And Libya? She's from
Egypt.
Egypt.
Right. So Egypt was in like 4 wars with Israel.
Jordan?
And
Jordan?
Jordan, right? Egypt and Jordan were and still are the strongest countries around that have actually been in war with Israel to a degree that people felt like it was an existential threat, right? 1973, the Yom Kippur War, people felt like this actually might be the end of the state. Those were the only countries that have ever threatened the existence of this state. With both those countries, literally from the days that peace accords were signed, that was it. There has not been any armed conflict. Israel's lived experience has been that peace is a sustainable way for security and actually works, right? But we don't learn about that. We don't think about that. There's no building of narrative around that. Building narrative is around how everyone always tried to kill us. And then you get militarized solutions out of that. So it's important to kind of point that out. I will just look at the time to understand where we're at. Okay. We're good. So that's kind of when we think about creating conscription, right? Those are the two things that I think are important to think about. The normalization of it and the narrative behind it. How do you build that? And if some of you do have the time to go to Yad Vashem today, think about that when you go through that museum. Okay? Museums generally in the world are amazing opportunities to look at what is the narrative that is trying to be told. Have any of you been in the Holocaust Museum in DC?
Yeah.
Anyone want to kind of think about what is the narrative that's told there?
Never again.
Is that the narrative?
Oh, it could happen.
It could have been. They definitely tried. So the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I think, is really interesting because it ends with other genocides, right? It ends with present days, not necessarily just genocides, ethnic cleansings, and things of the sort. It has like this plaque. It's very small, but I think that's where it's trying to go, right? With that never again message. For me, one of the things, kind of reading through that, was the amount of times that the word democracy came up. That was like the only thing. What I learned from the Holocaust Museum in Washington D.C. was that democracy is the solution to Nazism. And at the end of it, the ends of Holocaust museums for me are like the moment. At the end of it, there's a huge room that's dedicated for the U.S. Saving of Jews and the Jews who came to the U.S. after the Holocaust. Now, again, historically speaking, controversial. Like we can actually talk about quite a lot of time that the doors were closed and people couldn't move.
No kidding.
But that's the narrative that the U.S. has an interest to present, right? It's about democracy because that's the U.S.'s role in this, and it's about what the U.S. did do positively. And again, there's a lot of things in that war that the U.S. did do positively. I'm not trying to undermine it. I'm just saying that can all be true, but that's the narrative that's important to tell. If you look at the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, I'll spoiler alert. It doesn't end in 1945 or 46 if you want to still deal with refugees, right? That's usually where Holocaust memorials or stories about Second World War end. It ends in 1948, right? Ending a Holocaust memorial in 1948 tells a very clear story. It's about connecting that to the creation of the state. And the museum, it has a path. You have to go through a very specific path, like the one in DC. And the end of it is this overlook on kind of on Israel, really. That's the idea. And if you have a guided tour guide, that's what they'll tell you about why they built the architecture this way. It's about you ending that process and then looking at what was now created. It's crazy. It's not what the Holocaust, like, the idea that the Holocaust created this state is almost, I mean, it's almost a positive look at the Holocaust, right? Like that's it's crazy. That's what we come out of. But that is what it's about. There's a very interesting story just about politics of museums. There's this part at the end of the museum that is about where did Jews go after the Holocaust, and obviously it's all about Israel. And it used to be all about Israel, and there were actually a lot of U.S. donors who were like, wait. They didn't all go to Israel. So now it also says US and Australia because that's where money to the museum came from. Right? So if we're talking about like politics of museums, and again, it's not just this one, anyone you look at. I just think it's important to kind of think about, again, how these narratives are created and why.
Well, big sign at the start says something about Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, correct?
I didn't know that, but that doesn't surprise me.
Oh yeah, it is. I remember taking a picture of it 6 years ago. Now I don't know. I assume it's still there because
I mean, if they put the money in.
they donated millions for it.
So yeah. Anyway, so that's kind of about the creation of narrative. If we think about kind of some of the circular consequences of this, of having this extremely militarized society, I think one of the places that you really see it the clearest is when you look at our political system. A lot of our political systems, the way that people run political campaigns is based on their own military service, is based on the lack of the opponent's military service or not combat enough. There's a lot of gender dynamics to that. So when Netanyahu was running against Tzipi Livni, which is the last time that we had a prominent woman politician who was running, a lot of Netanyahu's kind of counter arguments was, forgive my language, but kind of like she doesn't have the balls for the job. That was kind of, I mean, not in those words, but more or less. And her counter argument was that she used to serve in the Mossad. She worked in the Mossad for many years. And so obviously she does. Like she has to prove herself in those terms. Those are the only terms they can prove themselves. Generally speaking, women are not as good as men in proving themselves in masculine militaristic terms. So it's also a question of what does that mean about gender in society? And we can talk about that for hours as well. But specifically, when we look at the Ministry of Defense, that's, I think, where it's clearest. The Ministry of Defense in Israel, since 1967 until today, we've had 2 ministers of defense who were not high-ranking generals before becoming ministers of defense. Right? The standard is that it is a high-ranking general, usually the last chief of staff. So what happens is that the Ministry of Defense is almost a rank up from chief of staff, right? There is no separation between the military and the political system. It's very clear. Today, specifically, we have one of those 2 examples that the Minister of Defense is not a high-ranking general. He's still a right-wing, racist fascist, so does quite the same. But we see this very strange situation where soldiers, the chief of staff, is trying to mile him down. It's a very strange context that we're in. But the default is that that is what the Ministry of Defense is about. It's another arm of the military. Which means that, yes, it gives military solutions. Again, and if we think about the human content of it, our previous Minister of Defense, Bughi Ya'alon, drafted at the age of 18, served in the military, went up the ranks, became Chief of Staff of the military, retired, and then went to be Minister of Defense. You give someone like that a problem, rockets coming in from Gaza. Of course he's going to give you a military solution. He's literally done nothing else in his life but be a soldier. He's going to think like a soldier, which makes sense. But that's our entire political system. Everyone here thinks like soldiers. And they give solutions that soldiers give, right? And again, if we think about the US context, what does it mean that that is today where your administration is moving? The head of the DoD historically was not a general. With the current administration, that's kind of the direction that things are taking, right? And I think it is important to kind of try to think, what does that mean? Consequences of how do these people act later on? If we go back to kind of those larger consequences, ex-generals and ex-chief of staff, other than going into politics, one of their favorite second careers is going into the military industry. Right? And you spoke before about the military-industrial complex. When we talk about militarization, it is important to look at Israel's military-industrial complex. First of all, because Israel is one of the 10th biggest arms exporters in the world in absolute numbers. If you calculate that per capita or per GDP, it is the #1 exporter of arms in the world.
Say that again. Genius.
I'm saying that in percentage of capita or GDP, Israel is the #1 exporter of arms in the world. When we talk about things like drones, On average, in the last 5 years, Israel has been the #1 exporter of drones in the world in absolute numbers. Okay? I'm saying on average in the last 5 years because last year China passed us. China. Okay? I mean, think about the size of economy we're talking about. It's crazy, right?
And our tax dollars are paying.
And your tax dollars are definitely paying for that. So my next question was going to be, why do you think that is? Like, how is it so successful? You can give up one
Because
answer,
because it's funded by us, by you.
right? So you have the U.S. funding to it. Any other thoughts about why that's so successful? Why can Israel sell so many arms? Why would people buy from Israel and not from China or the
They're field
U.S.?
tested.
Because they're field tested. Okay, so we have two. I'm gonna tell you 2 out of 3 answers. I never get the third answer. Nobody ever gets the third answer. We'll get to it at the end. So one of that is that yes, you have a very generous subsidy from the U.S. of about $3.8 billion a year. But does anyone know the catch on that money?
Has to go back to the U.S. has to use the money to build. And they got a contract with U.S. people to make the weapons. With
It
the
has to
money
be
that we
bought.
give.
It has to be bought in the U.S. All U.S. military aid worldwide has to be purchased in the U.S. Israel is the only country that had an exemption to that of 25% that can be bought overseas. That 25% in this current agreement, Obama administration agreement, is phasing out. Okay? So by the end of 2017, Israel will be like the rest of the countries, meaning 100% has to be bought in the U.S. What this actually means is that if we look at the lobbies that push for U.S. military aid to Israel, or the increase of it that was increased in 2016, ideas for who the biggest lobbies around this are? So almost the NRA, but NRA is small business on this. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, right? The guys that make the NRA look nice. So there's actually, it's much more an interest of the U.S. military industry than it is of the Israeli military industry, which actually comes to tell us that maybe isn't the main that's not a good reason for Israeli export, right? Or Israeli developing its own industry. On the contrary, this is forcing it to import. And if it was good for its own military industry, or that good, that would be a competition with Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin wouldn't want that money to be pushed there, right? So it's a more complicated process. When Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Boeing or whoever of them push for this, they know that they're not just getting a contract, $3.8 billion, that will go into U.S. military industries, and Israel will just get a product in the end. They know they're not just getting that, they are also getting something that is related to what you were saying, which is that their weapons will be used by the Israeli military. And this goes back to the Bulata character, the Sacha Baron Cohen character, right? The image that Israeli military has, the label around it, is that it is one of the best militaries in the world, if not the best, relatively to its size. What that means is that if it chooses to use a weapon, that weapon must be good. Right? So we have the technical aspects of this, that Israel is able to develop and test weapons on a regular basis on a civilian population. That's what holding an occupation means. You constantly try your weapons, and then you market them as battle proven. You literally have stamps and posters saying battle proven. That's how you sell weapons. But there's also the specific label of the Israeli military attached to that. It's not just battle proven, it's battle proven by this really, really good military. So Lockheed Martin are also benefiting from the fact that their weapons are now used by the Israeli military, right? And get that stamp of battle proven and battle proven by those guys. And we see a lot of places where that plays out that are ridiculous. I mean, does anyone know the F-35 project? Yeah. F-35 is a huge project. It's a fighter jet, sixth generation fighter jet, I think they call them, or fifth, whatever. It's a state-of-the-art, most amazing thing you can possibly imagine. It's stealth, it's long distance, it's heavy-duty bomber, anything you could possibly need from a plane. It's also a complete disaster. It is a $1.5 trillion project, right? 1.5 trillion over 55 years. It is literally too big to fail. Like that's what they invented that phrase on. That is. It has manufacturing in almost every congressional district. So go find the congressman who dares vote against it. It doesn't sell. It's a pretty bad plane. It had 360 something malfunctions in the first editions. Yes, are being corrected with time, but still, it's a stealth plane that is developing way slower than radar technology is. It is a long-distance bomber in a world where no country that can afford to buy it needs to bomb anyone long distance.
Yeah.
Right? If the U.S. wants to bomb Iran, they can do it from the bases in Saudi. They don't need to fly from the U.S. It's useless, and most of aerial combat generally in the world is moving more and more towards drones. Drones are super cheap, they're very efficient, they can stay very long in the air. Starting to sound like a marketer from the military industry, so not like attention. Just to say, from a military perspective, the F-35 doesn't make sense. From an industry perspective, it does.
It makes money for all the producers in all the areas.
And it's a contract Pentagon can't get out of, not at this point. But they can't sell plane either, which means Lockheed Martin keeps making money out of it. Pentagon doesn't. Which means that the DoD has a problem. And they really need to sell that plane.
Did you
And
get
so- So Israel was asked to not purchase, to receive through the military aid these planes, and Israel said no. We really don't want them. And the U.S. kept pushing, and actually the U.S. threatened Israel. Again, this is Obama administration. We can't even blame this current administration. The U.S. threatened Israel in what was probably the strongest threat towards Israel that we have heard in a few decades, and none of you heard about it. The threat was that Israel will break its military agreement with Israel that promises that the U.S. doesn't sell other countries around us the same level of weapons. Right? So there's an agreement that other countries in the Middle East don't get the same level. The U.S. literally threatened Israel to break that agreement if they don't agree to receive F-35s. Israel agreed and did receive them. And the day that that sale was announced, the stocks of Lockheed Martin went up. The stocks of Lockheed Martin. Now you can sell this plane, right? Have Israel use it for a bit, and you'll be able to sell it. Now, again, Israel doesn't need to, and Israel has been, operationally speaking, continues to use the F-16s, but we have F-35s, and that's the important thing. And so it's just important to kind of remember that in kind of the background of it. And it's not just weapons, it's also training, right? So Israel trains militaries and police departments around the world, including your own. There's something to say about, so Israeli border police, the nice people that you've met quite a few times around here, legally speaking, it's a hybrid military police unit, but they're soldiers, right? And they act like soldiers. They were founded to control civilian Palestinian population. That is the goal of that unit, right? Those are the people who are doing most of the training of police forces in other places around the world. They come and they train a police force. What they are training them how to do is how to control a civilian enemy population. That's what Palestinians are considered here. And then that's what your police forces learn how to do, how to control a civilian enemy population. St. Louis police got that training in 2014, and in the summer of 2014, they treated the people in the streets of Ferguson as an enemy population. And that's how you control an enemy population. Right? When you train people, when you export arms, when you export tear gas or rubber bullets or anything of the sort, you're not just training or giving a tactic or giving a weapon, you are exchanging an ideology that comes with it. The ideology that crowds should be dispersed, right? Otherwise, why do you sell crowd dispersal equipment? The ideology that, yes, these are enemy people because that's how you train people to react to them. It's far bigger than just the weapons exchange themselves. And important to say, this is a two-way street. I'm not saying that Israel is militarizing the U.S. I'm saying that this
We'll do it
relationship
right now.
is highly militarizing both these societies and others that are doing the same thing. And this is what we see today. There's this kind of growth in this concept of militarized police, of homeland security, of militarized borders. We're seeing it now with Europe, how the refugee crisis is used to militarize borders in the continent that really tried to demilitarize its borders for quite a few decades now. And this is doing the opposite effect. And we can take kind of Naomi Klein ideas about the shock doctrine and how that's used in different contexts. I think we can use that and see how the refugee crisis in Europe is exactly being implemented that way. So that's just kind of to put us back into the global aspect of that. We are about to be out of time, and I do want to leave time for questions. Really small thing just to say, the other reason that Israel can export arms so well is that we have no regulations about who not to sell arms to. There's no human rights restrictions in law that prevent us from selling to anyone, which means we sold arms to South Sudan, including when there was a UN embargo to it, Myanmar, including through the UN embargo, right now to the Philippines. I don't know if people are tracking what's happening in the Philippines, but it's pretty crazy. We last week just had a visit from Duterte, from the president of the Philippines, who promised his soldiers personally that he will take personal responsibility if they rape women, as well as comparing himself positively to Hitler, saying that he would happily kill 3 million, he got the numbers wrong, but happily kill 3 million drug users. Very nice guy. Israel sells weapons to him. Actually, Duterte now at least gave an official statement, we don't know if it's going to be true, that he has instructed his military and police only to buy from Israel because those sales come with no restrictions. Right?
Does Israel produce arms?
A huge amount. So Israel, we were talking about its export before, one of the biggest producers in the world. And the vast majority of that is for export. So that's just to kind of put the last piece of the puzzle. I'm going to stop now because that's a lot.